The discoveries become more frequent, the discoveries become bigger, but something like this, for example, they didn't have to do any digging, they didn't have to do any excavating. It was all done.
The Great Pyramid is a testament to ancient Egyptians' ingenuity, acumen, and technical and scientific prowess.
A worn limestone slab sits behind glass in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Most visitors walk right past it. They are looking for gold masks and painted coffins. But this slab carries a sentence that quietly challenges everything the official timeline claims about who actually built the Sphinx and what may still be sealed beneath it. The slab everyone walks past. In the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, surrounded by the gold masks and painted coffins that draw the crowds, sits a piece of limestone that almost nobody stops to look at. It is catalogued as Journal Dentree 2091. It stands about 70 centimeters tall and 42 centimeters wide. Its surface is covered in hieroglyphs worn down by time, and to the casual eye it looks like exactly what most museum visitors assume it is: a mundane record from a civilization that produced thousands of mundane records. Tourists move past it toward the spectacular pieces: the gold of Tutankhamun, the painted sarcophagi, the towering statues. This unremarkable slab of limestone does not compete for attention in a museum filled with treasure. But this slab contains a sentence that, read carefully and taken seriously, challenges the official timeline of the Giza Plateau in a way that very few visitors ever realize. It claims that the Sphinx and the temple structure beside it were not built by the pharaoh who has received credit for them for nearly 2 centuries of modern Egyptology. According to the text carved into this stone, they were found already standing. They were repaired. They were inherited from builders who came before. This is not a vague myth wrapped in metaphor. It is a literal claim, pressed into stone by people who had every reason to want the official story to be simple and flattering to their own civilization. And the fact that they recorded something different is exactly what makes this slab worth a much closer look than it usually gets. How the slab was found. The slab, known to Egyptologists as the inventory stela, was discovered in 1858 by the French archaeologist Auguste Mariette. He found it near the ruins of a temple dedicated to the goddess Isis, located east of the Great Pyramid on the Giza Plateau. The physical object itself is straightforward to describe: a limestone slab roughly 70 by 42 centimeters, divided into neat horizontal registers, each one carrying carved text and imagery in the organized style typical of ancient Egyptian temple records. Most of what is written on the stela is exactly the kind of material that makes Egyptology feel, to outsiders, like a discipline obsessed with administrative paperwork. It is an inventory, a list of 22 divine statues, described by the materials they were made from and their sizes. It reads like a temple accounting record, because that is essentially what it is. But at the top of the stela, in the heading that introduces this otherwise routine inventory, sits the problematic sentence. The text states that the Temple of Isis was already standing on the Giza Plateau when the pharaoh Khufu arrived there. Khufu is the pharaoh credited with building the Great Pyramid, generally dated to around 2580 BC. According to the standard textbook account, Khufu's reign represents the founding moment of construction at Giza. The inventory stela tells a different story. It describes Khufu not as the founder of what was already there, but as someone who discovered it, restored it, and found the gods already present inside before he built his own pyramid beside the existing structure. That single distinction, founder versus discoverer, is where the entire controversy around this otherwise unremarkable slab of limestone begins. What mainstream scholars say. The response from mainstream Egyptology to the inventory. Stela has been consistent for well over a century, and it rests on solid evidence about when the object was actually carved. Stylistic analysis of the carving itself, along with the specific patterns of spelling and grammar used in the hieroglyphic text, point clearly to a much later period than Khufu's reign. Scholars date the stela to the 26th dynasty, also known as the Sate period, which places its creation at approximately 670 BC. That date sits roughly 1,900 years after Khufu actually lived and ruled. Several specific details in the text support this later dating beyond just the general style of the carving. The stela uses titles such as Isis, mistress of the pyramid, and it references the Sphinx using specific names that do not appear anywhere else in the written record until more than 1,000 years after the pyramids were actually built. These are not the kinds of details a scribe working during Khufu's actual reign would have used, because the religious and linguistic conventions they reflect had not developed yet at that point in Egyptian history. The scholarly consensus that emerged from this evidence is that the inventory stela is what researchers call a pious forgery. The idea is that a temple operating during the much later Site period created a flattering backstory for itself, claiming ancient origins it did not actually have in order to gain prestige. Claiming a connection to Khufu and to ancient sacred origins was a form of religious and political marketing, a way for a comparatively newer temple to claim the authority and the mystique of deep antiquity. This explanation is reasonable and well supported by the evidence about the stela's actual age, but it leaves open a specific and uncomfortable loophole that even early pioneers in the field of Egyptology were willing to acknowledge. The loophole. Nobody can close. Gaston Maspero, one of the foundational figures in early Egyptology, conceded an important possibility regarding the inventory stela that the simple forgery explanation does not fully resolve. A late tablet, carved during the Sate period, might still be a copy of a much older document that no longer survives in its original form. This was not an unusual practice in ancient Egypt. Recopying old sacred texts onto new monuments, updating their physical form while preserving their content, was a normal and accepted part of temple practice across Egyptian history. Religious institutions regularly transferred important texts from deteriorating older materials onto new, more durable surfaces, preserving the content of ancient records even as the physical object carrying that content changed. This means the carving itself can genuinely be young, dated correctly to around 670 BC by every reliable method available to modern scholarship, while the actual claim recorded on it could still be ancient, copied forward from an earlier source that the Sate period scribes had access to and considered worth preserving. This distinction matters enormously for how seriously the claim deserves to be taken. If the stela is simply an invention created from nothing in 670 BC, then the claim that Khufu found the Sphinx already standing is just a marketing story with no historical weight behind it. But if the stela is a later copy of a genuinely older record, then the claim becomes a piece of testimony passed down through Egyptian tradition itself, a claim that the Egyptians of a later era believed, based on their own access to earlier records that we no longer have. The carving's age tells us when this particular copy was made. It tells us nothing definitive about when the underlying claim originated.
When hieroglyphics are first translated in the 1820s, it unlocks a trove of new information about the pyramids of Egypt and why they were built.
What the word actually means. One specific term used in the inventory. Stela's text has generated its own separate debate, and it centers on a place name that appears throughout Egyptian religious literature. Rosatau, sometimes rendered as Rostau. The standard scholarly reading of this term treats it as mythological language. Rosatau is interpreted as a poetic name for the kingdom of the dead, the spiritual realm that the god Osiris rules over in the Egyptian understanding of the afterlife. Under this reading, the term describes a necropolis in a spiritual or symbolic sense rather than a specific physical location. Common translations render it as gate of the dead or other world. Evocative phrases describing a metaphysical destination rather than a place you could actually walk to. But a literal translation of the underlying hieroglyphs tells a somewhat different story. Read for their direct physical meaning rather than their symbolic resonance. The signs that make up this term can be translated as mouth of the passages, or opening of the corridors, or entrance to a system of tunnels. These are not abstract, poetic phrases. They are physical descriptions of an actual geographic feature, something with an opening, with passages, with corridors that lead somewhere. The full title that appears in connection with this term in the inventory stela and elsewhere is House of Osiris, Lord of Rosetow. The word for house in this phrase, transliterated as pur, is the everyday Egyptian word for a building. It is the same word used to describe ordinary dwellings, the kind of structure a person could actually walk into. It is not a word reserved exclusively for describing heaven, the afterlife, or some intangible spiritual realm. Read this way: the phrase is not describing a metaphor for death. It is describing a physical location with a physical structure that has physical passages leading into it. It reads less like religious poetry and more like an address, a record of actual geography rather than spiritual symbolism. And once you start looking at the Giza Plateau with that literal reading in mind, several discoveries on the ground start to look considerably more significant than they otherwise might. The shaft beneath the causeway. The first piece of physical evidence connected to this literal reading sits beneath the causeway leading toward the pyramid attributed to the pharaoh Khafre, Khufu's successor. A vertical shaft cut directly into the bedrock was noted on survey maps as early as the 1830s, where it was simply labeled Shaft Number 1. In the 1930s, the Egyptian archaeologist Selim Hassan partially explored the shaft, but he was unable to reach its lowest level because that section was flooded with groundwater. Hassan attempted to pump the water out over a period of 4 years, but the effort failed. Water kept rising back up from an underground source that his pumping equipment could not overcome. The shaft remained unexplored at its lowest level until 1999, when Zahi Hawass led a renewed excavation effort. By this point, changes in the regional water table had dropped the groundwater level enough to allow full excavation for the first time. Hawass himself described the work as among the most exciting of his career. What the team found was a structure with 3 descending levels. An upper chamber sat closest to the surface. A deeper chamber below it contained carved niches and stone sarcophagi. The lowest level descended approximately 30 meters below the surface and contained, even after the partial draining, a chamber still filled with clear groundwater. Sitting within that lowest chamber, set directly into the floor, was a massive granite coffin. Carved into the floor of the lower level was a hieroglyphic sign, the symbol pur, the same everyday word for house discussed earlier. The mainstream interpretation of this carving treats it as a cenotaph, a symbolic tomb intended to mirror similar structures found at other Egyptian sites, such as the famous symbolic tomb of Osiris at Abydos. This is a reasonable interpretation supported by precedent elsewhere in Egyptian religious architecture. But an alternative reading is available, and it connects directly back to the literal translation of Rosetow discussed earlier. If the term genuinely describes a physical system of passages, and if the pur symbol genuinely marks a physical house within that system, then this shaft, descending 3 levels into the bedrock, terminating in a flooded chamber holding a massive stone coffin, fits the description with a precision that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The geological context of the Giza Plateau adds an important layer of plausibility to this picture. The plateau sits on limestone, and limestone is a material that dissolves slowly over the course of millions of years when exposed to water. This process forms cavities, fissures, and natural voids throughout the rock, along with channels where water moves through the stone over time. The bedrock beneath Giza was never a solid, uniform mass. It has always been riddled with natural openings, which means that any claim about extensive passage systems beneath the plateau is at least geologically plausible rather than physically impossible from the outset. What modern physics found? For more than a century after the first serious archaeological surveys of Giza, The interior of the Great Pyramid remained what researchers describe as a black box. Only 3 chambers were known to exist inside the structure, and because the site is so heavily protected, researchers cannot simply dig wherever they want to look for more. Excavation at Giza requires extensive approval and invasive digging into one of the most significant archaeological monuments on Earth is something authorities are understandably reluctant to permit. Beginning in 2015, an international team of physicists and engineers launched a project called Scan Pyramids, designed to examine the interior of the Great Pyramid without any physical excavation at all. Their method relied on a technique called muon tomography. Muons are subatomic particles that are constantly produced when cosmic rays strike the upper atmosphere. They rain down on the Earth's surface continuously, and they pass through solid stone, being absorbed at different rates depending on the density and thickness of the material they pass through. By placing detectors inside and around the pyramid and carefully measuring how muons passed through different sections of the structure, researchers could effectively create an X-ray image of the pyramid's interior without ever touching the stone. In November 2017, the team published their first major findings in the prestigious scientific journal Nature. They had discovered what researchers now call the Big Void, a previously unknown space located above the Grand Gallery, at least 30 meters long, with a cross-section comparable in scale to the Grand Gallery itself. This represented the first major internal structure discovered inside the Great Pyramid since the 19th century. The finding was confirmed using 3 separate detector technologies, analyzed independently by 3 different research teams based in Japan, France, and Egypt, all of whom arrived at the same conclusion. Further discoveries followed in 2023. Researchers identified a previously unknown corridor located behind a set of chevron-shaped stones on the pyramid's north face. The corridor measured approximately 9 meters long, 2 meters wide, and 2 meters tall. Researchers were able to push a small endoscope camera through the masonry to capture actual footage of the space, confirming the existence of an ancient sealed passage that no one had known about for the entire span of modern Egyptological study. The implications of these findings are significant regardless of how they connect to the inventory stella's claims. The textbook understanding of the Great Pyramid's interior, built up over more than a century of study using only the 3 known chambers, was incomplete in ways that nobody had previously suspected. Non-invasive physics, applied for the first time, found void after void, hidden space after hidden space, sealed corridor after sealed corridor. The monuments at Giza are considerably more hollow than the standard accounts had ever admitted. The ancient Egyptians described a system of passages connected to this site. Modern physics keeps finding more passages. The pattern is difficult to ignore. The erosion that does not fit. A separate and entirely independent line of evidence concerns the physical condition of the Sphinx itself and the trench-like enclosure carved out of the bedrock around it. The inventory. Stella's claim, again, is that Khufu found the Sphinx already standing and repaired it rather than building it. This claim gains unexpected support from a long-running debate among geologists about the specific pattern of weathering visible on the walls of the Great Trench, the enclosure carved from solid bedrock that surrounds the Sphinx. The weathering pattern on these walls is unusual. It shows deep vertical fissures and an undulating, wave-like profile that some geologists argue is the signature of water erosion specifically, the kind of pattern produced by heavy rainfall running down exposed rock surfaces over a very long period of time. Researchers, including Robert Schoch and Colin Reeder, have advanced versions of this argument, pointing to the erosion pattern as evidence that the Sphinx enclosure is considerably older than the standard textbook date associated with Khufu's reign. The mainstream response to this argument offers several alternative explanations for the same weathering pattern. Wind erosion acting over time, salt crystallization within the porous limestone, which can cause flaking and surface degradation, the natural decay process of particularly soft limestone layers exposed to the elements. Groundwater wicking upward through the stone from below, which can produce surface weathering effects that superficially resemble rainfall damage without actually requiring rainfall to produce them. It is worth noting that even Colin Reeder's version of the water erosion argument is considerably more conservative than some of the more dramatic claims associated with this debate. Reeder does not argue for a lost advanced civilization or for a vastly ancient date measured in tens of thousands of years. He argues specifically that the Sphinx enclosure may predate Khufu, and that the Giza Plateau experienced significant rainfall runoff during the early dynastic period of Egyptian history, before the climate of the region shifted toward the dry desert conditions that have characterized it ever since. What makes this geological debate significant in combination with the inventory stela is the convergence of two completely independent lines of evidence. The geology of the Sphinx enclosure hints, through erosion patterns that conventional explanations struggle to fully account for, that the structure might be older than Khufu's reign. The inventory. Stela states directly, in its own words, that Khufu found the Sphinx already standing. Two separate forms of evidence, arrived at through entirely different methods and by entirely different researchers working in entirely different fields, point toward the same uncomfortable implication. The foundations of Giza may predate the builders who have traditionally received credit for them. The radar announcement. In March 2025, a research team held a press conference that drew roughly 1,000 attendees and was live-streamed to audiences around the world. The team included Filippo Biondi from the University of Strathclyde, Corrado Malanga from the University of Pisa, and an explorer named Armando May. Their announced methodology involved a technique called synthetic aperture radar tomography, which uses satellite radar data combined with specialized software designed to read extremely subtle ground vibrations. The approach effectively uses the planet's own natural microtremors as a kind of sonar system, allowing researchers to interpret underground structures based on how those tremors move through the ground. The claims that emerged from this announcement were extraordinary by any standard. The team reported finding, beneath the pyramid attributed to Khafra, 8 enormous vertical wells or cylindrical shafts arranged with spiral structures, descending to a depth of approximately 648 meters into the earth. Beyond these shafts, they reported finding 5 identical multi-level chamber structures connected by geometric pathways and a tunnel system stretching approximately 2 kilometers, potentially connecting beneath all 3 of the main pyramids on the plateau. The implication of these claims, if accurate, would be staggering. A buried structure system larger than everything visible on the surface, and potentially older than the dynasty credited with building the monuments above it. The team explicitly connected their findings to the ancient name Rosatau, mouth of the passages, suggesting that their modern radar scan had located the literal physical address that the ancient Egyptians had been describing in their own texts for thousands of years. Why Egypt's top archaeologist says no. The response to these radar claims from established Egyptian archaeology was immediate and forceful, and it came from one of the most influential voices in the entire field. Zahi Hawass, the same researcher who led the successful excavation of the Osiris Shaft in 1999, and who remains one of the most powerful figures in Egyptian archaeology, rejected the radar claims outright. He publicly called the announcement fake news. His specific criticisms were detailed and pointed. No radar equipment, he stated, was ever actually used inside or directly under Khafra's pyramid. The researchers making the claims, according to Hawass, never traveled to Egypt to conduct the work they were describing. Their methods have not been formally approved or validated by any recognized scientific body. The findings were never submitted to peer review. The underlying raw data behind the dramatic renderings shown at the press conference has never been published for independent researchers to examine and verify. Beyond the objections raised by experts, there is a major regulatory issue surrounding the radar team's claims. The Supreme Council of Antiquities oversees all work at Giza, and any excavation or investigation requires official approval. A project involving deep exploration beneath a protected monument would demand extensive authorization. No evidence shows that such approval was obtained. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, and so far, the evidence presented has not reached that standard. An honest look at both sides. Putting the radar claims and the inventory stela claims under the same level of scrutiny produces a clearer picture of what can actually be trusted and what cannot. The problems with the radar claims are significant. The work has not been peer-reviewed. An earlier published study from the same general line of research, dated to 2022, found only small features rather than anything resembling the dramatic structures announced in 2025. Independent experts in radar and geophysical imaging have expressed skepticism, pointing out that no known radar method currently available can resolve detailed architectural features at a depth of hundreds of meters with the kind of clarity the announcement implied. Signal degradation at that depth is a serious physical limitation. The dramatic renderings presented at the press conference may represent significant interpretation layered on top of noisy, ambiguous underlying data, rather than a clean and verifiable picture of what is actually there. The problems with the inventory stela are also real and well established. It genuinely is a late carving, produced during the 26th dynasty, roughly 1,900 years after Khufu's actual reign. The per hieroglyph at the bottom of the Osiris shaft has a perfectly ordinary religious explanation as a symbolic cenotaph, requiring no exotic interpretation at all. The Sphinx erosion debate has credible, well-qualified conventional geologists arguing for explanations that do not require any departure from the standard historical timeline. Strip out every speculative and unverified claim from this entire picture, and the result is not an ordinary, boring conclusion. Even working only with confirmed, published, peer-reviewed facts, what remains is still genuinely strange. What is actually confirmed? Setting aside the unverified radar claims entirely and working only with established, published evidence, several facts remain solidly on the table. The ancient name applied to the Giza Plateau, when translated literally rather than symbolically, references a system of passages, a real geographic feature rather than a purely spiritual concept. Beneath Khafra's causeway, a real physically confirmed three-level shaft descends 30 meters to a flooded chamber that no one was able to drain for years, with the hieroglyph for house carved at its lowest point. Inside the Great Pyramid, internationally verified physics experiments using muon tomography have found genuine, previously unknown voids, and sealed corridors have been discovered and documented within the last decade, confirmed by multiple independent research teams using multiple detection methods. The geological reality beneath the entire plateau is that the bedrock is limestone, a material naturally riddled with cavities, fissures, and water channels formed over millions of years. And an actual ancient Egyptian tablet, regardless of when it was physically carved, records the testimony that the greatest pharaoh of the Old Kingdom found the Sphinx already standing on the plateau and merely restored what he found, rather than building it from nothing. What we still do not know. Taken together, the confirmed evidence points towards several uncomfortable conclusions that established Egyptology has not fully reckoned with. The Giza Plateau appears to be considerably more hollow than has traditionally been admitted. Its foundations may be older than the builders who have received credit for them. The vast majority of what lies beneath the surface has barely been explored at all. The ancient people who lived and worked on this plateau during the Old Kingdom left behind their own account of what they found there, and that account does not describe a clean, simple act of original creation. It describes inheritance. They treated Giza as something they had received from before their own time, not something they invented from nothing. They built a tomb dedicated to the Lord of the Passages. They labeled an underground chamber as a house. They named the entire plateau after a system of corridors that, by their own account, predated their own civilization's arrival there. And at the literal bottom of the most thoroughly excavated shaft on the entire plateau, the lowest chamber of the Osiris shaft, the water is still there. It beat Selim Hassan's pumping efforts for 4 years in the 1930s. It has never been permanently removed. The massive granite coffin discovered in that lowest chamber still sits in groundwater, in the dark, exactly as it was found. No one has ever excavated beneath the waterline in that chamber. No one currently knows what, if anything, lies beneath it. The water has simply never allowed anyone to look. The inventory stela still sits in Cairo today, catalogued as J2091, resting quietly behind glass with a label that almost nobody stops to read. The quiet, impossible sentence carved into its surface has remained perfectly legible for roughly 26 centuries, waiting for someone to take it seriously. The state of the physical evidence remains exactly where it has been left. The Osiris shaft is still flooding at its lowest level. Whatever does or does not exist beneath Khafra's pyramid remains sealed and unconfirmed by any verified method. The big void discovered through muon tomography remains empty in the data and entirely dark to direct observation. The mouth of the passages, if the literal translation is correct, and if it genuinely refers to a real physical system rather than a spiritual metaphor, remains closed. The ancient Egyptians told us the name of this place. They told us, in their own words, what to look for. More than 2,000 years of accumulated sand and accumulated assumptions buried the question underneath layers of confident, simplified textbook explanation. The people who first walked this plateau and left written records behind were not claiming to have built everything from nothing. They were writing down what they themselves had found already there. How much of Giza have we actually seen with our own eyes? How much of it is still sitting in the dark, waiting? The Cairo slab has carried a 2,600-year-old mystery. Giza's hidden voids and the Osiris shaft remain unexplored, suggesting ancient secrets may still await discovery. More of this story is still buried, and it is not staying buried for long. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes up next.